Hello and thank you for downloading. My name's Steve Johnson, and this is the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Hello and welcome to this episode of Inquests and Inquiries. For this episode, I'm going to go back to my more traditional area, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats, which many of my followers will be more familiar with my commentary on. This episode's an interesting one because the inquiry is not complete at the moment, and I've generated it following a little bit of a look at the website for the inquiry, which is, I would say, generously not the greatest inquiry website I have seen. Even though it's in progress, there are inquiries in progress which are much better at being engaging and available to the public, for whom ultimately the public inquiry is supposed to serve the function of making available information and material in order to allow them to understand what has happened and why things have gone wrong. So not the greatest of websites at the moment. Hopefully they will perhaps take an opportunity to improve things, but there's broken links, things are not in the right place. It's all a bit not great. One particular bit that I found interesting was packs of evidence that they have created, which are interesting in their own right. It's actually quite a nice function to see. Not actually something you've seen on every inquiry website, but quite hard to digest. So a great choice for artificial intelligence to approach. So what you're about to hear now are two artificial intelligence podcasters that have been trained on a pack of material, which is the evidence bundle, the first evidence bundle for the inquiry. So it's a collection of statements, reports, newspaper articles, which I'll include in the notes for the show here. And they've been asked to look at this and ask what really happened, how well did the police respond, and what key recommendations might they make on the basis of just the information they've seen so far, which I think will be quite an interesting experiment to see how well that reflects what the inquiry ends up saying when it gets to the point of actually providing its final report. So without further ado, over to the artificial intelligence podcasters.
Picture this, a quiet Sunday in Salisbury, England. People are just going about their day enjoying the sunshine. But then suddenly emergency services rush to a park bench where a man and his daughter have collapsed.
Oh, wow.
It was March 4th, 2018, the day Sergei and Yulia Skripal were found unconscious. This incident quickly became a major international incident, and you've asked us to look into it.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating.
We want to see how well the police responded and what could be done to improve responses to these kinds of events.
Right.
So let's dive into what you sent us. We've got news reports, government statements, even some legal documents and some analysis from a chemical weapons expert.
Wow, that's quite the collection.
It is. It's a lot to unpack, but it's a really, really intriguing case. And the fact that Sergei Skripal was a former Russian double agent definitely adds another layer to it.
Oh, absolutely. It's like something out of a spy novel, except the stakes were incredibly high here.
Exactly. The potential for public harm was huge.
Yeah.
So let's rewind back to that day. What exactly happened?
Well, after Sergei and Yulia were found on that bench, they were rushed to the hospital. It was only after they were admitted that things took a really alarming turn. The investigation revealed that they hadn't just fallen ill. They were victims of a nerve agent attack.
And not just any nerve agent. Right.
It was Novichok, a military-grade substance developed in Russia.
So using Novichok, that immediately raises suspicions. Right?
Oh, absolutely. It pointed to a very specific and dangerous source.
So suddenly the police were dealing with a public health crisis and a potential international incident all at the same time. How did they respond to all of that?
Well, from what we can see in the news reports from The Guardian and The Independent, it looks like the local Wiltshire police were the first ones on the scene. But because of what the attack was, the investigation had to escalate pretty quickly.
I can imagine.
Yeah. It ended up involving the Metropolitan Police counterterrorism unit scientists from Porton-Down, and even the military got involved.
So a massive coordinated effort.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
They had to identify exactly what this substance was. They had to decontaminate all the areas the Skripals had been, and of course investigate who was behind it all.
Right. And I read that the investigation led them to the Mill Pub and Zizzy restaurant.
Yeah, that's right. The Skripals had been to both those places that day, and traces of Novichok were found at both locations.
And public health officials had to issue instructions to anyone who who might have been in either of those places, right?
Yes. According to the BBC reports and the government statements that you sent, there was a huge public information campaign. They were advising anyone who had been to those locations to wash their clothes thoroughly and double bag them. They also had to wash their hands and any other items that couldn't be washed in a machine with warm water and detergent.
It sounds like they had so much to deal with at once, containing that immediate threat, informing the public, and trying to figure out who was behind the attack and why.
Exactly. And they had to do all of this with the media breathing down their necks.
Yeah.
You can see how the media frenzy unfolded if you look at the reports from places like The Guardian and the BBC.
Right. Everyone was trying to figure out what happened and what it meant for public safety.
For sure.
So a lot of pressure on the police and the government. So focusing on the police response specifically, do the sources point to any missteps or areas for improvement in how they protected the public?
Well, most of the reports commend the police for how quickly they acted and their collaboration with all these other agencies, but there was some criticism too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the chemical weapons expert in your sources points out that there was a bit of a delay in recognizing how serious the incident really was.
Oh, I see.
It took several days to actually confirm that Novichok was used, and during that time, the public were mostly in the dark about the danger.
So they didn't know the true nature of the threat right away.
Exactly. And that could have put people at risk. If they'd known sooner, maybe they could have taken more precautions or more people could have been advised on what to do.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And what about the long-term health monitoring of those who might have been exposed, even if they weren't showing symptoms right away?
Yeah.
Did the sources mention anything about that?
Yeah, that's an important point. The sources, especially that analysis from the chemical weapons expert, highlight that long-term monitoring could have been better. Novichok can have effects that are delayed, so the full extent of the damage isn't always obvious immediately.
So even though they seemed to respond well initially, there were definitely things that could have been done differently, more proactively, to make sure the public was safe.
Absolutely. And these are the kinds of lessons that are really important for being prepared and responding to similar events in the future.
Right. Well, let's talk more about those lessons after a quick break. We'll be back to discuss what your sources suggest as the top 3 recommendations for improving government responses to incidents like this one.
This case really shows how important it is to always be looking at how we respond to these kinds of threats and improving those responses.
Yeah,
What starts out looking like something contained to one area can become a much bigger issue very quickly.
for sure. And speaking of the bigger picture, you mentioned some recommendations from our sources for how governments can respond better to similar incidents. What would you say are the top 3?
Well, based on what you sent me, particularly the analysis from the chemical weapons expert and some of the recommendations in those legal documents, I'd say the top 3 are enhanced preparedness, strengthened international cooperation, and a robust counter-disinformation strategy.
Okay, so let's unpack those. Starting with enhanced preparedness. What does that actually mean in real life?
It comes down to investing in special units training and resources that are set up to quickly identify and respond to these types of attacks.
So it's not just your average, everyday police response, but teams that are specifically equipped to handle the challenges of something like chemical weapons.
Exactly. We're talking about things like making sure first responders have the right protective gear and decontamination equipment.
Right.
And just as importantly, making sure they're trained to deal with these dangerous materials safely and effectively.
I imagine having very clear protocols to assess and contain the spread of contamination would be critical too.
Absolutely. The Salisbury incident showed how quickly these situations can get out of control.
Right.
Having those protocols in place can really make a difference in minimizing casualties and keeping the public safe.
It's about being prepared for the worst-case scenario, even if it seems unlikely.
Right. Because as we saw in Salisbury, if you're not prepared, the consequences can be really bad.
Okay, so enhanced preparedness is key.
Yeah.
What about strengthened international cooperation? How does that come into play?
Well, it's about working with allies to stop rogue states from even thinking about using chemical weapons in the first place,
Okay.
and then to enforce those international agreements like the Chemical Weapons Convention.
So basically putting pressure on anyone who might consider using these weapons and making it clear that there will be consequences if they do.
Exactly. It means sharing intelligence, coordinating sanctions, and presenting a united front when we condemn these actions on the world stage.
Because one country acting alone probably wouldn't have the same impact as a coordinated global response.
That's right. It sends a powerful message that using chemical weapons is completely unacceptable and will not be tolerated.
And finally, what about that third recommendation? A robust counter-disinformation strategy. Why is that so crucial, especially in a case like this?
Well, as we saw with the Salisbury poisonings, Russia immediately started trying to spread disinformation. They denied responsibility and put out all these conflicting
It's
stories.
that old saying, isn't it? The first casualty of war is truth.
Exactly. And in this case, it was definitely a war of information. A strong counter-disinformation strategy means you have to anticipate and refute those false narratives.
So you have to be ready to tackle misinformation
Yeah.
quickly and decisively.
Yes. And it's about giving the public clear and accurate information and working with those social media platforms to stop the spread of propaganda.
Because we all know how fast misinformation can spread on social media these days.
Right. And that can be really damaging, especially in a crisis, when it's so important for the public to trust the authorities.
So to summarize, the 3 key recommendations from our sources are enhanced preparedness, strengthened international cooperation, and a robust counter-disinformation strategy.
And if those are done well, they could make a huge difference in reducing the threat of similar attacks happening in the future.
This has been a fascinating look at how we can better prepare for and respond to these types of threats.
Yeah.
But before we finish up, I want to come back to what you specifically wanted to focus on in this deep dive. How well did the police respond to protecting the public? What are your final thoughts on that, based on everything we've discussed?
Well, it seems like the police response in Salisbury was kind of a mixed bag.
Okay.
They got praise for being quick to act and for collaborating with all the different agencies.
Right.
But they were also criticized for being a bit slow off the mark at the beginning and maybe not fully understanding those long-term implications.
So what does this all mean for our listeners? Why should they care about how the police handled a nerve agent attack in a small town in England?
Well, because what happened in Salisbury wasn't just some random event. It represents a type of threat that's becoming more and more common these days.
Here.
Attacks from states that blur the lines between spying and terrorism.
And those attacks could happen anywhere, not just in those spy novels or movies we see.
Exactly. It's a new kind of conflict that can play out in quiet suburbs, busy city centers, or anywhere, really. And it often uses unusual weapons and tactics, like those chemical weapons, cyber attacks, and those disinformation campaigns we were talking about.
So this attack in Salisbury, as shocking and tragic as it was, can be seen as an opportunity to learn from.
Absolutely. It shows us that we all need to be more aware of these changing threats and to understand how they can affect us.
And it shows that governments need to be more prepared to respond to incidents like this, both in terms of protecting people and stopping future attacks.
Exactly. And that's where those 3 recommendations we talked about are so important. Enhanced preparedness, strengthened international cooperation, and those robust counter-disinformation strategies.
Because as we've seen, these attacks can have consequences that reach far beyond those immediately affected. They can impact international security and global stability.
That's right. The Salisbury poisonings were a wake-up call. It showed us that even in a world that seems peaceful, we're not safe from these kinds of threats.
And as scary as that incident was, maybe the most important thing we can take away from it is that we need to learn from it. We need to adapt and become more resilient in the face of these new challenges. So as you go about your day, remember that the world can be a complicated and unpredictable place. But by staying informed, being vigilant, and supporting those working to keep us safe, we can all help create a safer and more secure future.
It does seem like the police response in Salisbury was a bit of a mixed bag. They did some things well, but there were definitely areas where they could have done better.
Right. So they got praise for acting quickly and collaborating, but were criticized for those initial delays.
Exactly.
Oh.
And maybe not fully grasping those long-term consequences.
Right. So let's bring this back to our listeners. Why should they care about how the police handled a nerve agent attack in some small English town?
Because the Salisbury poisonings weren't just a one-off incident. They show us a kind of threat that's becoming more common these days.
What do you mean?
Attacks from states that blur the lines between espionage and terrorism.
Oh, wow.
And these attacks, they could happen anywhere, not just in those spy novels or movies.
Okay.
It's like a new kind of conflict happening in quiet suburbs, busy city centers, anywhere, really. And they often use these unconventional weapons and tactics like chemical weapons, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, all that.
So the Salisbury attack, as horrible as it was, can be seen as a learning experience?
Exactly. It shows us that we all need to be more aware of these evolving threats and how they can impact our lives.
And it highlights the need for governments to be more prepared to respond to these types of incidents, to protect people and prevent future attacks.
Right. And that's where those 3 recommendations we talked about are so important, that enhanced preparedness, the stronger international cooperation, and robust counter-disinformation strategies.
Because these attacks can have consequences that go way beyond those immediately affected. They can impact international security and global stability.
Definitely. The Salisbury poisonings were a wake-up call. They showed us that even in a world that seems peaceful, we're not immune to these threats.
That's a sobering thought. And as scary as this incident was, the most important thing is to learn from it, to adapt and become more resilient in the face of these challenges. So as you go about your day, remember that the world can be unpredictable. But by staying informed, being vigilant, and supporting those who work to keep us safe, we can all help create a safer and more secure future for everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Remember, you can find more information on the website, inquestsandinquiries.com, or on the YouTube channel as well. Link in the notes.